Now, having said all that, we work with companies across a wide variety of industries, local industries we have here locally, like aerospace and internet retail and traditional brick and mortar retail, software products, and so on, as well as companies we don't really have a huge presence with in the Pacific Northwest, such as telecom and computer hardware and manufacturing and financial and healthcare and so on. So we get to look at a lot of different companies, and that is interesting because you'll find clusters of practices that you find repeatedly within a particular kind of industry, and sometimes you don't see a lot of cross-pollination. There might be a practice that works really well in embedded software in the medical space and that somebody in the computer hardware embedded space isn't using, interestingly enough, because people don't move back and forth that much. And so we often have an opportunity to say, hey, we've seen this not just a few times, but a lot of times in one segment, say, embedded software and medical devices, and we're not seeing it much at all in, say, computer hardware devices. There's a good opportunity there for some cross-pollination. So which companies can we talk about? Well, unfortunately, most of our work is covered under non-disclosure agreements, and the work that's not covered under non-disclosure agreements would still probably be fairly career-limiting for me to disclose details. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is essentially a talk that is informed by our work with the various companies, the dozens or hundreds of companies I've mentioned, but the specific details I'm going to share are all details that are in the public record. So I may piece them together a little differently because of what I've seen in the confidential context, but as far as the details, I'm not disclosing anything that you couldn't have read in a magazine or seen in a conference presentation or that kind of thing. Okay, so with that as background, let's take a look at a sample of world-class software organizations. The first one I'm going to talk about is our local favorite, Microsoft. I think that we could make an argument about whether Microsoft is still a world-class software organization. I don't really want to have that argument. I'd rather go back in time and talk about a time when I think it was pretty clearly and indisputably, in my mind, was a world-class software organization, which also happened to be the time that I was actually working on campus there in the 1990 time frame. Not that my presence was responsible for that. All right. So what were the attributes that made Microsoft world-class? Number one, very selective recruiting practices. Microsoft was the place to work at that point in time, at least locally. I was amazed at that point in my career how if I went to a party and people found out I was working at Microsoft, I instantly became the center of attention and everybody wanted to ask me questions about what's it really like at Microsoft. Now these days, I don't suppose that happens much anymore, but back then, that was like, wow, that's really cool. And as a result, they were able to be extremely selective about who they hired. And I would say that they were successful in being really selective at who they hired. Tom DeMarco is fond of pointing out that the programming world is a little bit like Lake Wobegon. In Lake Wobegon, all the children are above average. And DeMarco points out that most of the software managers he meets believe that their teams are above average. And I would agree with that. Most of the software managers that I've worked with over the years really do believe that their teams are above average. That can't possibly be true, because on average half the teams have to be below and half the teams are above. But Microsoft is probably the one place that I have had direct experience with where I would say that the average level of the staff, at least in the 1990 time frame, clearly was above average. And not just a little bit above average, a lot above average. It's one of the places I worked where I would sit in a room and wonder if I really was the dumbest guy in the room. And that's with my ego, that's not something I sit around wondering a lot. But at Microsoft, I actually did because they hired extremely selectively. Another attribute of Microsoft culture in that time frame was incredibly unvarnished technical discussions. That is to say, people would have knockdown, drag-out fights over technical subjects, and the fights would stay technical. They didn't go into name-calling, they didn't go into invoking people's personalities or anything like that. They stayed on the technical topic. That is, one guy would say, that is the stupidest idea I've ever heard, and here are the 14 reasons why. And then the other guy would say, all 14 of your reasons I already thought about, and here's why none of them actually matter. and they would just go at it. And the thing that took me a while to get used to was that once the discussion was over, it really and truly was over. It wasn't that anybody was building up any grudges or harboring any hard feelings. Once they'd had the knockdown, drag-out technical discussion, then they were done. And I felt like I was kind of sometimes watching those old Foghorn Leghorn cartoons where you've got the dog and the chicken, and the chicken's constantly trying to catch the dog, but then when the lunch whistle goes off, they sit down and eat lunch together, and then when the lunch whistle, or when lunch ends, they start chasing each other again. That's kind of what I felt like at Microsoft in that time frame, because these guys would just, basically, I would think that they hated each other, and then it would be like, hey, it's time to go to lunch, where do you want to go? And I never actually grew to like the completely unvarnished, bare-knuckle aspects of those discussions, but I did come to appreciate the efficiency in the rapid exchange of ideas and the relatively quick resolutions. And that's something I've actually tried to replicate in my own company, not the part that was kind of impolite, I thought, or inconsiderate. Polite I care less about, considerate I care more about. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting attribute. What about defined process? Stage gate, well-defined processes? No. This was not even remotely on the radar screen. It was pure cowboy culture. And the fact of the matter is, I think that you can get away with a lot of stuff when the people you're working with really are from the top of the talent pool that you can't get away with when you're working with people who are in the middle or the bottom. The fact of the matter is, you know, if you can do something with a 7-person team that in another company would take 50 people, those 7 people can take some shortcuts that are actually going to work out fine for them that a 50-person team cannot. And if you take a very high level of skill and then you add in very long or very high level of dedication and some very long work hours, you know, the influence of those 7 people is magnified a lot. There was a story at Microsoft at the time. Microsoft was working with OS2, or working with IBM on OS2, and Microsoft was very frustrated by IBM's participation on OS2. Microsoft had a relatively small team, IBM had a very large team, and there was a story that went around at Microsoft in that time frame that was popular in the OS2 group that went like this. The story was that Microsoft and IBM were in a boat race, and Microsoft had 8 people rowing and 1 person steering. IBM had 8 people steering and 1 person rowing. And after Microsoft won the boat race conclusively, IBM commissioned a 6-month, $2 million study to figure out what they had done wrong. And at the conclusion of the study, after analyzing many factors, the conclusion of the IBM study was that the 1 person rowing needed to row harder. And the reason I tell that story is I think it exactly captures Microsoft's view of how IBM was operating at that time. Whether it's true or not, or grounded in fact or not, I don't care about, but I do think that it accurately depicts Microsoft's mindset in that time frame. And clearly, a lot of process and overhead was not part of that mindset. The focus was on letting the people who were in a position to do the work actually do the work, and so that was a clear and really non-controversial position.